Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Carrico. I'm a senior fellow here in the International Security Program at CSIS. And I'm delighted to kick off this morning's Maritime Security Dialogue with Vice Admiral Moore. The Maritime Security Dialogue represents a co-hosted series between CSIS and the U.S. Naval Institute, or USNI, and it seeks to highlight both current thinking and future challenges facing the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. Today represents our second dialogue for 2017, and we look forward to welcome you all back for additional events throughout the year. We would also like to thank, in a special way, Lockheed Martin and Huntington Ingalls Industries for their support in making this event, really this series, possible. And before we get underway for big events like this, we also like to make just a brief announcement, safety announcement. We don't expect any difficulties, but should there be anything, as a convener, we just want to make sure that you know we've got some exits right here in the back on both sides and stairs down the front. And both myself and Anthony Bell in the back will be your responsible officers to kind of direct you in the right way, just in case anything should come up. Just look for one of us. And so for our formal introduction, to get us started, I'm going to turn things over to Vice Admiral Peter Daly, retired, the Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. Naval Institute, and we're happy to have him here and to be partnering with USNI. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay, well, welcome. For those who don't know me, Pete Daly, CEO, Naval Institute. The Naval Institute and CSIS are proud to bring you this Maritime Security Dialogue series, continuation now in our third year. And as mentioned, we give special recognition to our sponsors, Huntington Ingalls Industries and Lockheed Martin, for making this event possible. Now I'll introduce our speaker for today, a 1981 graduate of the Academy, also holds degrees from George Washington University and a naval nuclear engineering degree from MIT. After serving 13 years as a nuclear propulsion qualified surface warfare officer, he made a lateral transfer to the engineering duty officer community. There, he served in billets mostly focused on refueling complex overhauls of aircraft carriers. Major command included Major Program Manager for in-service aircraft carriers and Program Executive Officer for submarines, PEO subs. Finally, last year, in June, Vice Admiral Tom Moore assumed command as the 44th Commander of NAVSEA. I point out that there's over 75,000 uniformed and civilian employees of NAVSEA. NAVSEA is entirely responsible for the contracting and supervision of all Navy ship and sub shipbuilding, and responsible for the maintenance and the systems that go on those ships directly. So we welcome Admiral Tom Moore, who controls 1/4 of the Navy's budget.
Thanks, Pete. I always am reminded of that by the CNO. Hey, by the way, you have 1/4 of the budget. That's not necessarily a good thing. So good morning, and thank you for the invite this morning. Before I get started, so last night was a big night for the Navy. A couple of things. One, my band, P.O. and the Carriers, played live down at the waterfront. And then, let's see, what was the other thing that went on last night? Oh, yeah, the other thing is we delivered the Ford to the Navy. So kind of a big night for us, actually, from my perspective, having worked on Gerald R. Ford for most of the past 10 years. Just came back from a very successful acceptance trial on the Boarding Acceptance Survey, and the Navy accepted delivery of the Ford last night. So you heard it here first. So thanks for the opportunity to come talk this morning. The theme that was given was the maintenance challenge and how to reset the fleet. And so what I'd like to do is talk about this in kind of in the context of talking about where the CNO is headed with the size of the fleet, and then talk about what we're doing to grow the size of the fleet on the new construction side, but then importantly talk about how the maintenance side of that equation fits in. It's not as Admiral Daly and I were talking beforehand, it's not either. You got to do both. And so sometimes we tend to forget about that. Having been a shipbuilder for most of the last 15 years, but also having spent 3 years on the OpNav stuff on fleet readiness, I'm well aware that you got to do both. You got to maintain what you got, and you got to continue to build going forward. So if you haven't read the CNO's white paper on the future Navy, get a copy. It's a good read. I like to tell my Master Chief it's short, has some pictures in it, so it's great for Command Master Chiefs. Their lips do not get tired when they read it. And the CNO's white paper talks about, I think importantly up front, what the current security environment is. And he makes 3 key points, and these 3 key points are applicable whether you're talking new construction or whether you're talking the maintenance side of the house. And the 3 key points are time matters. There has to be a sense of urgency in some of the things that we're getting after today. And that applies to across the board, to getting ships and submarines out of availabilities on time, to figuring out how you can design these ships quicker and get them built quicker. Second thing is that the pace today is exponential. And if you go look at the world today and the threats that we're facing, the learning that's going on in our near-peer competitors, say Russia and China, and the pace that they're changing their capability is growing out exponentially, and we have to keep up with that pace. As Casino likes to say, it's kind of like we went into halftime of a football game in 2000 up about 28-3 and kind of popped the champagne and said game's over. And in fact, the referee came in and said, hey, halftime's over, we're ready to start the second half. And we said, well, we'll get there when we get there. And we kind of strolled out midway through the third quarter, only to find that the score was now 28-24. And so that capability gap between us and our competitors is really closed, and it's something that's really a keen interest to us here on the Navy side of the house in terms of what's the capability that we need going forward. So there's a lot of discussion going on today about what is the Navy that we need, and not necessarily what is the Navy we need necessarily in the 2040s, but what's the Navy we need in the 2020s. And we tend to talk a lot about what's the Navy we need today, and we're trying to take a little bit of a lead angle and figuring out what is it the Navy we need, probably in the mid-20s, and go make some decisions based on kind of that Navy that we need in the 2020s. Now, there's been a number of recent studies, some done by the Navy, some done by independent groups, about what is it the Navy you need, what should it look like. And they all have kind of varying mixes of ships and stuff, but at the end they all came to the same conclusion, is that we need a bigger Navy than we have today, and they're all around the 340 to 350 ships. So clearly the size of the fleet does matter going forward, and the capability of that fleet's also going to matter importantly as well. So, how do we get there from here? So one of the things when we talk about the size of the fleet, and I know I'll get questions often about, hey, the 18 budget didn't add a bunch of new ships. What happened? We were never going to be able to turn that around overnight. I think what you're going to see, and I'll get to it a little bit more later in our remarks, is the 18 budget kind of holds what we have on the new construction side, but makes a significant investment on the readiness side of the house, which I think is, if you listen to the Vice Chief's testimony back in February, his point was, hey, the first dollar we get ought to go to readiness, and I think that's what you're seeing in the 18 budget. Now, we spent a lot of time, and the CNO has spent a lot of time talking about what is the strategy, the future Navy white paper, the design for maintaining maritime superiority is all goes to what the Navy's strategy is going forward. And it's easy to say, having been in Washington, D.C. now since 1999, I tell people I'm on my 18th palm, which is kind of hard to imagine. And if I had a dollar every time someone said, you know what, we need to build the strategy first, and then the strategy will drive the budget. And in the world that we live in, that sounds great, but the reality of it is you don't want a budget completely driving your strategy, but you can't ignore the fact that we live in a fiscally constrained environment. So, what we would like to say about the Navy budget is that it's a resource-informed strategy. And I think that that's the reality of where we are today. So we're going to increase the build of the ships that we have today. We think the industrial base can probably build over the next seven years, based on the capacity they have, probably 29 more ships than we had in the original 310 ship plan. We've got to get more capability for that dollar. We've got to figure out where the knee and the curve is with industry to get them to go work on this stuff. And then we got to go figure out how to innovate and what is it exactly we're going to work on the new construction side of the house. So we're going to continue building DDGs. We're going to continue to build the amphibs that we have today. There's an ongoing discussion on LCS and the frigate. that is still kind of churning around inside the Pentagon, and we owe some answers to the Congress here later this summer on that, and you'll see some things going on in that particular area. As we head out further out, and you've probably heard me talk about this before, the future service combatant, what the replacement for the CGs is, that's going to be critically important as well. Kind of the new buzzword inside NAVSEA and inside the Pentagon is SWAP, space, weight, and power. And if you've heard me talk about before, as we go build the future Navy, while I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, I can tell you that one of the things that's really, really important for us as we build these platforms is to make sure that the platforms have enough space, weight, and power so that you can modernize and adapt to future threats. We are kind of in an age of electric ships, you've probably heard me say before, and DDG-1000 and Ford-class carriers are prime examples of kind of building in space, weight, and power into the platform so that you can adapt and go forward. And interestingly, the DDG-51 class, which is around today and serving well, as we've gone and they're going to build Flight 3A, we're going to provide a little bit more space and a little bit more power in that going forward. And those ships are kind of unique in their ability to stay around. It was interesting, my first department head was on DDG-17 USS Cunningham, and we used to get rid of ships back then at about the 25-year point. And we probably got rid of them at the 25-year point. We didn't do maintenance on them. If anybody served on a DDG knows that they were tough to maintain, but the reality is we didn't spend any money on the maintenance side. And so at the 25-year point, a lot of people think, hey, we ought to get rid of these things because they're rust buckets. The reality of it is that we really got rid of a lot of those ships because from a combat system standpoint, they had become obsolete. And so fast forward to today with take the Arleigh Burke class today and take a look at open architecture and spy radar and vertical launch. And now you have a platform that can stay around a lot longer. So now we have to kind of shift the thought process. Now we have a combat system that's not obsolete. So now back over to the maintenance side of the house and reset the fleet. Now, if you want to get more service life out of the hull, you got to do the maintenance on it. And Admiral Daly and I were in, when I first became a flag officer back in 2008, and he was down at Fleet Forces Command, we had kind of reached this epiphany where we had not spent any money doing maintenance on our service ships for about 10 years. And we woke up one morning and found out, oh my goodness, we're failing all these in-serves and we don't have ships that can get out to their expected service life. And, in hindsight, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you don't make investments on the maintenance side of the house, you can't expect the ships to get to where they need to get to. And we had kind of gone along happily for about 10 years saying, hey, look, not doing maintenance and saving that money to do other things, it's working. The reality of it is we were consuming the service life of the ships that was built into them and the redundancy, and eventually it caught up to us. And we spent the better part of the last probably 8 to 9 years digging ourselves out of that hole, particularly as it relates to the surface, private sector, the surface ships and cruise ships. So one of the key components, I think, of getting out to the size of the fleet that we need is going to be looking at taking the DDGs and the CGs and the amphibs we have today and actually extending the service life of these ships. Most of them are in the 30 to 35 year range. And so we're taking a pretty close look at what would it take to get them out another 5, another 10 years. And the reality of it is for a steel hull, if you do the maintenance, you can get the service life out much longer. And with today's open architecture and vertical launch, I think there's great opportunity for us to make the investments, a relatively small investment, to keep ships around longer than we have today. And people will say to me, well, we've never really gone a surface ship past 35 to 40 years. And I will point out all the time, yeah, but we routinely take aircraft carriers to 50 years. And the reason we do that is because we consistently do all the maintenance that you have to do on an aircraft carrier to get to 50 years. So we know how to do this. And I think what you're going to see is we're going to take a very serious look at taking the service life of the existing fleet and extending it out 5 to 10 years. If you do that, and you've seen probably some of the force structure assessments, which gets us to 355 ships in around 2045, if you just keep ships at their current service life and then build new, we can probably accelerate that to getting to 355 probably by about 10 to 15 years with a relatively small investment over about a 30-year period. So we're going to take a very close look at that. One of the things that I've consistently pointed out as we go look at the new frigate design and go look at the future service combatant is we should not design a ship with a service life of planned service life of 25 to 30 years. Doesn't make any sense. We ought to go planned service lives of 40 plus years for all of our ships, and then build, in the swap context, space, weight, and power into them so that you can adapt them going forward. And I think that's going to be part of our strategy going forward. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is I wanted to talk about the maintenance side of the house and kind of resetting the fleet. If you heard the Vice Chief back in February, he talked about the fact that if I have the first dollar I get, new dollar I get, needs to go to readiness. And the good news is the FY18 budget has an unprecedented amount of money for readiness. And in fact, it's about $9.7 billion in the in the maintenance accounts to do maintenance on our ships. And that's good. We need that. Although, as I tell the folks in NAVSEA all the time, okay, we've got the resources we asked for. Okay, now it's over to us to deliver. But it's important to understand when you talk about maintenance that it's not just resources. And I'm quick to point out that it's just not just about money and not just about adding more people. That can't be the only part of the solution here. Clearly, the $9.7 billion that we get is going to help us. We need to grow the size of the naval shipyards. 33,850 people today. We're going to grow that to about 36,100. I think that's where we need to be to consistently deliver the nuclear-powered ships and submarines on time. Today, we're not doing a good job at that. Only about a third of them deliver on time. We've had a better year this year on the carrier side of the house, but 12 of the 17 submarines that are either in maintenance overhauls or in inactivations are behind. And so we have to kind of turn that around. And so people will help. Certainly the capacity piece of that's important, but it's not the only piece of it going forward. NAVSEA's number one mission priority is the on-time delivery of ships and submarines. And the reason it's the number one priority is because of the 275 ships I have today, about a third of them at any time are under NAVSEA's control, either in a CNO maintenance availability somewhere or some pier side availability. So to the extent that we don't get them out on time, it causes a great stress on the force. And you may have remembered there was an article back in January or February, I can't remember the exact month, where a reporter said that the U.S. Navy, for the first time, did not have an aircraft carrier at sea since the first time since World War I they didn't have an aircraft carrier at sea. And that's a pretty startling statement when you think about it. Part of that was because we were down to 10 carriers, but the other part of that was because the George H.W. Bush, which was in a maintenance availability at Norfolk, which was supposed to last 8 months, took 13 months. And so it just wasn't lost on me when I came into the job a year ago that NAVSEA's ability to get these ships and submarines out on time is critically important to resetting the fleet and getting the fleet to the size of the fleet we need. So back to my original comment. One, we need more people, clearly, but it can't be only about the people. There's a couple other things we're going to have to do here. So one, I've got to have the capacity to do the work, and that gets to the people side of the house. And then I've got to figure out new ways to train the workforce. The kids today, they're coming in, they learn differently than we learned. And the typical timeline to get a trained worker at a naval shipyard, from the time you get them in the door to the time they can go down and do something useful on the ship, was about 5 years. And we've got to cut that back. And new training methods today, we're looking to get so we can have somebody can actually go turn a wrench and do something useful on our ships in 2 to 3 years versus 5 years. And we're going to have to think differently about how we train the young men and women coming in today, because they learn differently than we do. The other thing is we're going to have to make an investment in the shipyards, both in the private side and in the public shipyard side, in order to get the work done more productively than we're getting it today. Many of our shipyards, some of them are several hundred years old. A lot of them were designed to build ships in the early part of the 20th century, and they're really not set up to handle maintenance the way that it should be. We typically, in terms of capital improvements in the yard, we make investments in equipment and replace equipment on the order of about every 20 to 25 years. The industry standard is about 10 to 15 years, less than that. I have buildings that are over 100 years old that I can't get work done. So we've got to go make a concerted effort to go look at, from an industrial engineering standpoint, how do we set our yards up, and we've got to be willing to make investments in our naval shipyards in order to get the work done more productively going forward. Finally, you've probably heard Kevin McCoy talk about this many years ago. We've got to take the entire industrial base into account here. And we do have capacity other places when we don't have capacity to do the work in our yards. And this one shipyard concept that we talked about probably 10 years ago is something that we're going to have to take a serious look at. Again, we're getting some significant help from both EB and HII Newport News on some submarine work right now. We're going to need that going forward. So We've got a lot of challenges ahead of us, but I think the good news is, from the maintenance side of the house, I'm very encouraged of where we're headed. We've got the resources that we need. We've got a firm strategy going forward. We'll start delivering ships and submarines on time. We'll take a very serious look at how we extend the expected service life of the ships that we have. And that will also be a part of our maintenance strategy. And I think when you combine those two things together and add that into the build strategy that we're going to have, that we've got a viable path going forward to get to 355 and may in fact be able to get there sooner than we would otherwise get there by just building new. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, and we'll have a seat here, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Wrapped, and it's pretty tough to catch up. How caught up are we? Are you satisfied? And maybe you don't agree with the premise, but I think it's a particularly challenging scenario.
Well, I think we have made major gains to catch up. What I don't think we've completely dug ourselves out of the hole, but I think and we've got some members for the in-serve board sitting over in a manner, but it's also meant to provide surge capacity. And I think we haven't yet tapped into the surge piece of it, and we're likely to see more use of, for instance, an aircraft carrier when she's in a 36-month cycle. If she's got a 6-month maintenance availability and then she works up for 8 to 10 months, she's got a significant period of time. So you send her on a 7-month deployment, you come back. We would like to continue to use her again. I think we're going to go look at we've made the investment in the maintenance, and we're going to go get the use out of the platforms. But as you go use the platforms, you're consuming the service life out of them, and it circles back to the importance of, to your point at the beginning, is, okay, if we're going to go use OR4P the way it's meant to be used and make the forces available, then we've got to continue. It makes it even more important to go do the maintenance, because there's a direct correlation between how much you use them and how much maintenance you have to do. One of the interesting things we found is in the post 9/11 era, even though the total number of steaming days for the fleet didn't change dramatically, what we found is that about 40% more deployed days than we had before, and it's kind of like running your car to church or running your car across country. We were running the car across country a lot more, and so we had to do more maintenance on it.
Yes. So you mentioned thank you for that, the shipyards and the need to recapitalize a lot of that infrastructure. You can go up to Kittery, Maine, and see buildings that are over 100 years old, so if that's important, is there money budgeted for the recap? You mentioned that you got maintenance money. Are you allowed to apply that to efficiencies and upgrades to the facilities and the capacity you have?
Yeah, I have limited authority to take the OMAN money to do that. One of the things I've been working at and have some very serious discussions, and frankly, the defense committees have been very open about having a discussion about providing more flexibility on, with some controls, on the use of that money to make some of the investments we need. On the same side, the MILCON side of the house, the MILCON budget is always, relative to the rest of the budget, relatively small. We need to compete for those dollars as well. And we're laying out a long-term investment strategy for the naval shipyards. The CNO has specifically asked me, what's the plan? This gets back to my original comment, which is, we're just throwing more money and more people at the problem by itself is not going to make us more productive. It will help. But there's a number of other elements to the productivity piece, and one of those is making the necessary investments in capital equipment, new welding machines, et cetera, but also providing shops and stuff that are, if you go and get your work done, that flows the material and flows the work into the ship better than we do today. So while we don't make the investments we need to make today, that's pretty clear. I mean, we meet the 6% threshold that's mandated by Congress, but that's kind of a hold what you got. And we're going to have to take a serious look at what it takes to go invest in these shipyards, particularly if we're going to grow the size of the fleet. I mean, the naval shipyards today can handle the 275 ships. But if you're talking dry docks and shops and throughput to handle a 355 ship Navy, then now you've got a completely different issue.
Right, I agree. Just to get back to the capacity issue, you've got a lot of folks out here who are working in industry, You've already, in your remarks, highlighted the fact that the 18, as far as the next proposed budget, it came down on focusing near-term readiness. Makes sense to a degree, but there was a lot of people, frankly, who were expecting a little bit more. You know, it's the same number of ships in the ship count for 18 as there were in the previous administration's budget. Are there things that you are looking at, and are there things that industry should be looking at as you lay in for the ramp up to 355, which, you know, so 18 is kind of a readiness year, but what should they be looking at?
Well, I think going forward, I think that we've, you know, in the force structure assessment, we've kind of laid out where we want to head. I would tell industry, you know, the key is we want to keep our production lines going. We want to, you know, with the new frigate or future service combatant, we need to look at, you know, ways to streamline the acquisition process. The new buzzword is set-based design, is a way to kind of take options and get through the early stages of what the design of the ship is going to look like. I think industry is partnering very well with us on that particular area. But it's going to be a combination of continuing to build, you know, DDG-51s and the hot production lines we have, and then innovating and figuring out how we can build quicker for the next set of ships that are going to come down the pipe. And some of those are, you know, we're continuing on building 4-class carriers. You know, as the CNO has stated in his white paper, I think we'd like to get to 12. That would change build centers from 5 to 4. I think that's one of the things we're looking to do. And then on the surface side of the house, you know, we've got a number of ongoing efforts that will, I think we're going to yield dividends here going forward. But we're going to have to continue to make the case on the budget side of the house for the resources necessary to get that done. And that, you know, that's obviously challenging in the environment that we're in today. And I think you'll see with the 19 budget and beyond that you know, we're laying out a compelling case for the size of the fleet we need and what it's going to cost going forward.
You mentioned you know, capacity also in terms of people, and you also mentioned maybe the, you know, dusting off Kevin McCoy's you know, one shipyard concept. Are we seeing strain in competing for the same people? A couple observations is that what we found with the sequester, the fiscal cliff, and some of the wild swings in avails was that we were turning on and off avails.
Yeah. And
then when you went back and you tried to find that person with that skill set, they either weren't there or you had to pay more. And then last I saw, and you'd have the latest, that you were still a little short on the government side of hiring the shipyard workers.
Yeah.
You had a goal through 16 of having about 2,000 more than you currently have on board. Are we eating ourselves on this, and is there a better way to do this?
Well, there is some tension early on, and in the near term, you know, we do compete for resources with other industries, and so when we do have these downturns, we tend to lose the workforce short term. But right. To your question, you know, can we get the workforce necessary to go build the ships that we need and do the maintenance? The answer to that's yes. We've had that in the past. You know, when I started working at Newport News Shipbuilding, or when I was a ship's company on Enterprise, refueling her in the 90s, Newport News had 27,500 workers, and Norfolk Naval Shipyard, I think, was up in the 30,000s at her peak. So we've got to provide, you know, you know, a package of things that would interest the young people to come work at the naval shipyards today, and industry would do the same. And yeah, we do compete for some of those people. So in the short term, some of them, you know, we grab people that they would like to have, and vice versa. But if there's a stable, predictable plan out there, and we know we're going to grow the size of the force, when I talk to the leaders of industry, they're not worried that they can grow their workforce. And frankly, I'm not worried that we are going to have a problem growing the size of the naval shipyards as well. I think you know, we've got a good plan out there, and we'll be able to press on with that going forward.
Well, last question before we open it up to the audience. You've mentioned that the good news is that we got a big bump up in O&M, operations and maintenance money, to do maintenance near term. What's the next big thing that you think past that you would like to see more investment? What, from a prioritization standpoint, where do you need the most help? Where would that, if Admiral Moran would spend that next dollar on ship maintenance, and he got his $19 billion, yeah. $19.8 billion, what's that next dollar go to?
Yeah, so I think, in my lane, on the maintenance side of the house, the next dollar goes into investing in the shipyards, making the investments necessary to go make the workforce more productive. There's an expectation, a correct expectation from the CNO and from the fleet that we're going to give you all this money. We want you to deliver things on time. But once you get the workforce and you've got the workforce that you need, we expect you to get better. One of the challenges we face today is, as we've added a significant number of people in naval shipyards over the last 6 to 7 years, is that I have a pretty young workforce. Half the people in the naval shipyards today have been there less than 5 years. And that's obviously, as we add another 2,000 people over the next 2 years, that trend's that's not gonna change significantly. So we've got to recognize we've got a young workforce, and we've got to go train them so they can become more productive, and we've got to provide them facilities to be more productive, because the expectation is correct, which is, hey, I'm going to give you the people and I'm going to give you the dollars, but I got to, at the end of the day, I need some of those dollars to go build ships and build planes and weapons as well. So once you get that workforce trained and it's there, I expect you to be able to figure out how to do a 250,000 man day availability for 230,000 man days, for example. And so I think that's the challenge that we face going forward. And so my next dollar would go into investments in the physical plant of the naval shipyards to make them more productive, so that we can ultimately, start tipping that OMIN budget over a little bit and let those resources go somewhere else where they're needed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's open it up. We'll have a few folks here. We can just call on you. Sydney, you get the first question. I ask you to identify yourselves and ask a question.
Yes, identifying myself for everyone who's not already thoroughly sick of me. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Good to see you both again, Admirals. You said some very interesting things about how if we invest in maintenance and extending the service lives of our current ships, we can get to 355 a lot faster. There's a big return on investment for that. I'd love you to walk through some of the details and the numbers on that. How much life are you thinking of getting out of what ships? I mean, is it, can every Arleigh Burke get another 5 years, or is it much more nuanced across class of blocks and so forth and that? What are sort of your best case, middle case, worst case scenarios for how much time you can bring that 355 goal closer to the present?
Yeah, so the answer to the question is, I think it applies to all the Arleigh Burke ships that have vertical launch, and we're not going to go back and some of the earlier Burkes, but I think this study has looked at, basically, I think from DDG maybe 53 or 54, I can't remember the number, but yeah, it essentially applies to all the Arleigh Burkes, and it will apply to all the the CGs, with the exception of like Tycho and Yorktown and Gates. How much service life can you get out of them? You can certainly get at least 5 more years. I think we've taken a look at it, and I'm convinced on the NAVSEA side of the house, extremely low risk. Frankly, we've kind of looked at it from the period, I think you can at least get it out to its next dry docking, and in which in many cases is more than 5 years beyond, with relatively low risk and relatively low cost. The key is, do the maintenance that you need to do, and then have some baseline modernization capability that you would like to have. So, on the combat system side of the house, today that's baseline 9 for Aegis. We kind of have an idea what that looks like on the C4I side of the house. So, I think it's a relatively low risk proposition. As I said, running the numbers, I think you could probably shave 10 to 15 years off of when it would take you to get to 355, if you're willing to consider the entire fleet in that set. Obviously, that's not. I'm not the decision maker on that, but from the technical side of the house, NAVSEA doesn't see anything technically that would prohibit us from extending the service life of the ships. Again, do the maintenance and do the modernization so that they are combat relevant going forward, and we know how to do that. So I don't think this is something that we're leaning that far forward on technically. I think it's pretty straightforward. I will say, on the aluminum hull side of the house, we don't have as much knowledge base on aluminum hulls and how they react over time. And we've seen some of the challenges with just the aluminum superstructures on the cruisers. So I'm not willing to go lean forward yet on how far we could get the the aluminum hull ships, which have a 25-year service life. But clearly on the steel hulled side of the ship, there's no technical issue going longer. The nuclear side of the house is the carriers will stay 50, and the SSNs have a whole series of separate issues. I think we've probably sharpened our pencils, and the SSNs are where they need to be today. So what I'm looking at is on the surface ship side of the house. The submarine force is, I think, pretty well understood how long we can take those out based on propulsion plan issues, and then issues associated with the hull from diving and safely operating submerged.
Can I just jump in here and ask you to hit one for a minute on cyber? We think of other commands as having the lead on cyber, but in fact, for the force in being and the force that you're building, NAVSEA has a huge challenge here. Could you talk a little bit about the special efforts required in that arena to become cyber compliant and secure?
That's a great question. I probably should have mentioned that in some of my remarks. And I would say, as part of this effort to extend the service life of the existing ships, when I talk about modernization, cyber is a key piece of that. So a lot of people, when they hear cyber, they think SPAY war, because they own all the IT systems. The reality is NAVSEA I'm responsible for all the HM&E systems and all the combat systems from a cyber perspective. And so we've got to stay out in front of that. No, I have got three main mission priorities within NAVSEA: on-time delivery of ships and submarines, a culture of affordability, and number 3 is cyber, for a very good reason. And, in the recent WannaCry thing that everybody read about in the paper, the ransomware stuff, that gets our attention.
It's real.
Pretty quickly. The reality of it is that our ships and submarines today, there's not an HM&E system or a combat system on that ship that doesn't have, it's not heavily invested in software and computers. And even I just came from riding the trials on Gerald R. Ford, a magnificent ship. She's got a machinery control system that allows you to take 1,000 people off that ship, that operates and the ship remotely, and not having to have sound and security watches, some of the things that we did in our earlier days, and that's great stuff. But all that stuff has computers associated with it. And so the cyber piece is not just don't hack into my email or get into my credit card. It goes a lot further than that on the ships today. And so we, NAVSEA, on the NAVSEA side of the house, and we have a very big focus on how do we go manage this going forward.
Have you had to set up any new staff organization or bring on new folks to deal with that?
Yeah, we have. We have a chief information officer now. We've grown the size of my workforce there. On the believe it or not, a lot of the cyber folks are in the engineering directorate in NAVSEA 05. We have a cyber council that I meet with monthly. And we're working very closely with NAVAIR and SPAY War on standards, and with Admiral Ty and 10th Fleet and Admiral Gilday on that. So, yeah, we're as we grow NAVSEA, and we would have to grow NAVSEA if we grow the size of the force. We're looking pretty closely at the cyber piece of that. Well, that's a key point.
Right. Thanks. More questions. Megan, you had your hand up earlier.
Megan, go ahead.
No, right here.
Okay, we're going to get you next.
Hey, sir. Megan Eckstein with USNI News. Since Sydney did me the favor of asking my first question, I'll ask you about the public shipyards. You mentioned trying to get the same maintenance availabilities done with fewer man hours, and I was just wondering if that would come as a result of upgrading the yard infrastructure like you mentioned, or if that would take some maybe rethinking how you approach the processes, how you kind of innovate the procedures.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all of those things. So one, it's if you've ever been, I use Ingalls as kind of an example. After Hurricane Katrina, they had the opportunity to rebuild, and obviously Katrina was a terrible blow to the Gulf Coast down there. But when they had the opportunity to go rebuild the facilities and kind of rethink how they laid things out, and you go look at how Ingalls is performing today on the new construction side of their house, they're knocking it out of the park. So anybody that does industrial engineering would tell you that how your shops are set up and how you flow material can go a long way towards making you more productive. But the second piece of it is the workers that are coming in today and training them and providing them with training facilities to get them up to speed quicker, and then providing them with the tools to be more productive at the deck plate level. I think, one of the things, we tend to be a pretty conservative organization on how we use technology. And there's great opportunity out there, I think, to use technology, including cell phones, et cetera. There's security issues with them that would allow us to be more productive at the deck plate. Today's kids learn a lot different. They're not used to throwing a drawing on the table. They're well versed on taking an app on a phone and looking at a drawing or taking a picture of something on the ship and then pushing a button and having the material delivered to them. And so there's a lot of opportunity here for us to get more productive that goes well beyond just adding people to the shipyards. Yeah. Thanks.
Will the government work rules that we have today allow you to take full advantage of that? Is that another thing to put on the pile with?
Yeah, it's another thing to put on the pile. I mean, I say we're fairly conservative about our use of new technology, but we get there eventually. And if you go look at the Ford today, we do things that we wouldn't, when I started back in 1981, that I would never have imagined that we would have allowed ourselves to do. So I think it's a recognition that you've got to embrace the technology. It does come with some risk, in particular on the cyber side of the house. But if you don't recognize that this is the way that people learn and this is the way we move information,
right.
I think we're missing a great opportunity to get better quicker than
Yes.
we would otherwise. So,
Right here in the front, on the end there.
yeah.
Hi, Lee Hudson with Inside the Navy. You mentioned the long-term plan for the public shipyards. Could you please be more specific about what you're assessing in terms of investments and people?
Yep.
And when do you anticipate the study to wrap up? And is that study congressionally mandated, or is that something that the Navy is doing on its own accord?
No, it's not congressionally mandated. We did a study back in 2013. The Congress kind of asked us to a plan, and we're kind of sticking with that plan today. This is something that I've asked for and CNO's asked for. So we kind of Portsmouth Naval Shipyard kind of got off and did this on their own a couple of years ago, where they hired an industrial engineer to go look at the layout and how workflows, and they mapped out where people had to walk to between the shops. And so they were able to go put that on the plate, and they showed that to me when I came in last year. I was very interested in that. So what we've made an investment to go out and do the same thing at the other 3 shipyards, to go get somebody that's a formal industrial engineer to go look at the yards and go map out where are the existing shops today, where do people have to walk to get the work done, and then where, if you were to optimize that, what would you do? So a combination of that, and then capital improvements on the facilities themselves in terms of welding machines, et cetera. And then the last piece of that is the dry docks. As we go to Virginia Payload Module to Block 5, the submarines won't fit in a lot of the existing dry docks. And Ford-class carriers, for example, use 13.8 kVA power on the pier, and have different cooling requirements. So we've got to upgrade the docks for those as well. So we have a long-term plan, investment plan that that I've shown to the CNO, that includes both the dry docks and then the facilities investments necessary to get there. It's not cheap. We're talking. You're talking, on the dry dock side of the house, probably over the next 30 years, an investment of on the order of $3 to $4 billion necessary to make the dry docks compatible. Those are kind of must-haves. If you want to have Virginia-class submarines with Virginia Payload Module and you want Ford-class carriers, you're going to have to upgrade your dry docks. The second piece of that is the one where I'm competing with everybody else for the dollars, which is to make the investments necessary in the shipyard. So yes, that plan, we have the basic outlines of it. I owe an answer back in the fall, and I think we'll finish up with full details in probably February, is what I've told them of 20. Is today 2017? Yeah, 2017,
yes,
28. In February of the next year, I think I'll have a bow on this thing wrapped up, and we'll lay out where I think we need to go from a NAVSEA perspective. And I'm having this conversation with the defense committees as well. They're very supportive and want to help in this particular area.
I'll move it over here. Sir.
Hi there. I'm Mike Stone from Reuters.
Hey, Mike.
Thanks for coming in. You talked a little bit about frigate and delivery and keeping costs down, and I wanted to understand how much time NAVSEA would need with a foreign design frigate in terms of survivability systems and breaking that down, and how that, if you can answer that, then how that would compare to domestic design.
Don't know that it would take I don't know. I don't think it matters where the design comes from in terms of whoever develops the design in terms of how long it would take us to evaluate it. I think that the thought is here on going forward with the future frigate is that it'll be a competitive environment that will include a look across a broad spectrum, and we could consider a foreign design as part of that competition. We haven't obviously gotten to that point yet, but if we got to the point where we were considering those designs, it won't take NAVSEA any longer unless I got to translate it from German or Dutch or something to do the analysis in terms of the survivability, et cetera. So I don't think there's any time difference between where the design comes from.
Okay. This gentleman right here on the end. Pass your mic.
Thank you. Rick Burgess, Sea Power Magazine.
Rick.
Admiral, the Nimitz class is halfway through its RCOH cycles, and I was wondering, is the Ford designed to have an RCOH at midlife, and if so, would there be like a gap between the last Nimitz and the Ford going in for an RCOH?
Yeah, Ford will have, the Ford class is designed for midlife refueling as well. We've gone on the submarine side of the house to life of ship cores. We looked at what it would take to get to life of ship 50-year core for a Ford class, and I think we concluded that while technologically feasible, it didn't make sense from a cost standpoint. If you're going to keep the ship for 50 years, you got to bring it in to a mid-life overhaul anyway, and the refueling portion is only about 10%, and it's not the critical path. So I think we concluded that from a cost standpoint, it just made sense to keep the refueling in there. So we will refuel the Ford class. Let me do the math in my head here. So Ford delivers yesterday. She'll be around for 50 years. So her first RCOH would be in 2040. If I had 23 years to that. So let's see. The last Bush was the last Nimitz class, and she will be around to 2057. So her midlife refueling, I never do math in public, as my staff tells me, will be in 2030. So there will be a little bit of a gap in the refueling program between when we refuel the last of the Nimitz class and when we would do Ford. Essentially, the gap's going to be when we delivered Bush in 2008, 9, and we're delivering Ford in 2017. So there will be an 8-year gap between the refuelings, and we'll have to address that when we get to it. There will be a lot of inactivations in Nimitz class carriers going on at the same time. So I suspect that will counterbalance if you're at new produced shipbuilding in the 2040, 2050 timeframe. That would counterbalance some of the loss of the work of not having a consistent RCOH program.
Okay. Over here on the right.
Admiral Moore, Admiral Daly, good morning. Rob Almeida from Rolls-Royce. A lot of what you spoke about this morning sounds like a huge data problem in a lot of ways, particularly when it comes to, what I see two data sets. I see the one data set being stuff coming off of OEM equipment, whether it be, say, a Rolls-Royce turbine. I mean, for example, we have a huge amount of data that comes off of turbines that fly through the sky on a commercial level all around the world. It provides us a really insightful way to do predictive maintenance on the aviation side. Now, that's commercial application. Within the Navy, there's a lot of other data that comes out that can come off the ship that is where the custodian is the U.S. Navy, and you may have information coming off of OEM equipment that is owned by, say, the OEM. Now, if you're trying to bring this information together and gain insights from it, how do you see handling that? I mean, we talked about cyber, but how do we handle who owns the data, who protects it, and who is able to interpret it in a way that enables you to gain efficiencies, right?
So one, I'm a big believer that the Navy should own the data going forward. And you're right, we absolutely have a lot of data coming off our ships today. We don't frankly make great use of it. You talked about Rolls-Royce engines. We've been up, the Navy leadership's been up to General Electric to see what they're doing in what they call digital twins and kind of the digital age and making decisions. I think that's a direction that we are absolutely need to head in. So I have, on surface ships today, I have a system called ICAS, the Integrated Condition Assessment System. We've had the ability to collect data for years. Frankly, we don't do a lot with the data to help us make decisions. But as we go to some of the systems we have today, with like the Ford's-class machinery control system, we have the ability to collect vibration data and temperature and stuff. And we absolutely have to go take a step forward and become more mature in the use of that data. And the CNO is absolutely driving us to go figure out how do you make use of the big data to make better decisions going forward. And it's across a whole host of different applications. In my world, it's on the maintenance side of the house. How do you use data to make better decisions about when you do maintenance and what type of maintenance do you do? The commercial industry is light years ahead of us in that particular area, and we've got to get better at it. But to the data portion of it, we need to the Navy needs to own the data so that we can make some, integrated decisions about what we're going to do.
Okay, right up here up front. We'll get you a mic.
Thank you, Admiral. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. As you grow the size of the fleet and extend service lives, how much do you anticipate that O&M costs will increase as you get towards that 355 ship number? And are you concerned that those additional O&M costs will eat into the amount of money available for procurement and new builds?
Well, clearly, like a car, and our experience with, say, Enterprise or Nimitz is now 42 years old. They do take a little bit more maintenance towards the end of their life. So, but if you're going to get to 355 ships, you got to recognize up front you're going to have a higher O&M cost. And if you're going to go into this thinking you can grow the size of the fleet by 80 ships, and that your O&M costs are not going to go up, you've got a problem. So I think we recognize that the costs are going to go up. They are a little bit higher towards the later part of stages of the life of the ship, but they're not astronomically higher in the Nimitz class. But part of the way that you can keep those costs under control is to make a consistent investment and do the maintenance throughout the life of the ship. What we have found on the Nimitz class is when you do the maintenance consistently in accordance with the plan, that you don't get you don't get any major anomalies. When you don't, then you have problems. So the classic example for us was Theodore Roosevelt, CVN 71. As we transitioned many years ago from a maintenance structure that we used to have into what we call today the incremental maintenance plan, most of the carriers got a complex overhaul to kind of reset them, and TR missed out on that. And so when she got into her midlife refueling, if you were to look at how many man days should she have had typically at 23 years, she had significantly fewer man days of work done on her in her first 23 years of life than the first four Nimitz class, then 68, 69, and 70. Excuse me, the first three did coming in, and 72 as well. And so we had a very challenging refueling overhaul, not surprising. And so I think you've got to, yes, it will cost you a little bit more towards the end of life, and we've got to factor that into our plans. But the key is consistent application of the maintenance plan and make the investments necessary on a regular basis to do the maintenance. If you do that, then you won't have these major perturbations in the last 5 to 10 years of the ship's life. That's kind of our experience.
And just in terms of it eating into procurement, how concerned are you then?
No, I'd say, you got to do both. As I said at the beginning, you have to do the procurement and you have to do the maintenance. If anybody thinks we can get to 355 without having growth in both of those accounts, they're living in la-la land, because that's just not going to happen. So we've got to factor both of those in to the equation, and we've got to have an upfront, honest discussion about the budget. But if you want to get to 355, you got to do both. You got to build and you got to maintain. If you skip on one of them, which has kind of been our history, is to stop on the maintenance, then you run yourselves into trouble. So if we're committed to 355 ships, we've got to be willing to go to make the investments on the maintenance side as well. So I'm not concerned they would eat into the procurement side. I think we just have to do that eyes wide open. I do think that one of the things back on the new construction side of the house that we don't pay enough attention to is is be willing to spend a little bit more money up front so that the total ownership cost of the ship over the rest of its life comes down. And I think we don't tend to make those investments because in the way the budget works is, the budget year you're in matters, and maybe the next budget year. But it's pretty hard for people to make investments today that are going to save you money 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And I think we've got to take a more total ownership cost perspective as we get into the next round of ships and be willing to make that investment. I mean, the Ford class, for all the talk about how much the first ship cost, we did make an investment in that ship that would save $4 billion per ship over 50 years compared to a Nimitz-class carrier. And so that's a significant savings. And while people may not be interested in that $4 billion savings today when they're struggling to balance the budget and build ships, I guarantee you if you're a fleet commander 15, 20 years from now, and you've got several Ford-class carriers out there, and the maintenance costs for those ships are significantly less than Nimitz, you're going to be pretty happy that whoever was building the Ford back in 2008 was smart enough to make the investments up front to reduce manpower and to improve the maintenance reliability of the ship.
Okay, on the end right there with the...
Toby Harshaw from Bloomberg View. You mentioned briefly that this modernization of the shipyards had to happen on the private side as well as the public.
Yeah.
You went into great detail on what you're doing in your 4 yards, but short of hoping for another hurricane, what do you do to make sure that the private side invests as much money in that as you guys are?
Yeah, well, so obviously we're not going to root for another hurricane. So I think, well, if you go look at the shipbuilders today, I think I'm satisfied the shipbuilders are making the investments that they need to make. If you can go look at Electric Boat and go look at Newport News Shipbuilding today, for instance, some of the things that they're doing to build facilities that will allow more work to be done inside. They have a thing at Newport News called the Unit Outfitting Hall, which is a significant investment which will allow them to get more work for Columbia and to do Ford-class carrier work inside. The challenge has always been on my side of the house is that the private sector is incentivized to make those investments because it makes them more profitable going forward. And so we're willing to, and we have been in contracts on the new construction side, been willing to partner with them and share some of those costs, and if they're willing to make those investments, kind of in a CapEx environment. But I'm satisfied that the yards today that are out there competing for work are making the investments necessary to keep those yards competitive. And that's one of the great things about competition. If the competition incentivizes them to make the investments necessary in the yard to make them more profitable. I don't have the same business model. That's kind of the challenge on my side of the house is I'm not out to make a profit. So what's the incentive for me to make investments in the yard? I need something along the same, I need that same type of thinking. To me, the investment is I get more productive and therefore I spend less OMAN dollars, back to this gentleman's question up front, less maintenance dollars in the future so that there's more money available for procurement.
Okay. Question here in the center. Admiral Shannon.
Jim, good to see you.
Morning, sir. Jim Shannon, Naval Academy class in 1981. That's what I'm representing today. You made a point earlier about a resource-constrained budget. If you could explain a little bit more about that, taking into consideration your service on the staff of IN4, the role you played then on getting the maintenance dollars increased for after you left IN4, and what are you seeing today among the resource sponsors? Does IN4 play that same role, or is that shifted over to IN9? How does IN6 play in all that, and how does that impact you and your budget?
Yeah, well, we're clearly, we clearly always have more requirements than we have dollars. I don't think that's new today. It may be tighter, the gap may be bigger, but we've always kind of faced that challenge. The OpNav organization today places more of the role of managing the dollars with the N9 organization. N4 still plays a prominent role in assessing what the requirements are. And I think the process is more transparent and more open than I've seen it in the past. And so, you need to, I'm going to get quoted on this, but the OpNav staff doesn't operate sometimes in an enterprise fashion, in other words, and it was designed that way to provide, you had OpNav 986, and they're pretty much focused on surface ships, and 98's on the aviation
A
side.
built-in advocacy.
Yeah, so they're the advocates for that. And so they tend to advocate for that. And so, I think what we're trying to get after is an enterprise look that says, hey, where should the next dollar go to make the most impact for the Navy? And I think the N9 organization, in concert with N8, what I've seen today in my 18 years in DC, that it's as good as it's ever been, that we are having that open discussion in kind of a corporate board manner, if you would, to decide where's the money going to go, what are the specific trades, what happens if you put the dollar here, what happens, what don't we do, and we're more looking at, instead of winners and losers, where it's really more of a getting back to the CNO's constant question is, what's the Navy we need? And so I think we are trying to work pretty hard to optimize the resources we have to get to the Navy we need. So I'm satisfied that the processes that we have today, and we're always kind of tweaking it and fine-tuning it to make it better, is pretty good and pretty robust. And the Navy leadership we have over on the Echelon side is doing a terrific job of, I think, managing that. And I think everybody gets a voice in the process. And as a result, I think we have a better outcome.
We just have a few seconds left, and I see General Gregson in the front row there, so I have to ask this question. There was some concern that especially the amphibs had not received the love and attention that they need. We talked about the surface Navy, but within the surface Navy, you've got those assets which are very large, very complex, and important. Could you talk a little bit about recovering their readiness, and are you satisfied, and the crosstalk between the Navy and the Marines on that?
Well, I've got a Marine on my staff who manages amphibious ships for me, the C-21 staff, which does maintenance, talking to the Marine Corps all the time. N95 is a very strong advocate for the amphibious warfare branch at OpNav. And where there may have been in the past a tendency to place more of the resources on the crew dev side of the house and the nuclear side of the house, today, I think we have robust class maintenance plans across the board, and we understand the service life requirements of the amphibious ships. Starting with LPD-17, they're being well maintained today. We're about ready to finish up a maintenance availability on WASP down in Norfolk, and she's going to go over and be an FDNF ship. So I'm satisfied that we're making the investments necessary there, and I've been on a lot of the amphibious ships as well. I don't see any indication that they're the last person in line for the maintenance dollars.
Right. Now, you just mentioned WASP. She had to sit out for like 5 to 7 years because she had an obsolete combat direction system. So that's an example of recovery. It's a good one.
WASP is so she just came back from a deployment at the end of the 2016, and we immediately threw her into an availability to get her ready to go be an FDNF ship, and they've done the crew and the contractor have done extremely well, and we're pretty close to getting her out of there, and she'll get over to Japan and do great things over there.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to cut it here, but we want to thank Admiral Moore for giving his remarks today and giving us the time he gave us for questions. He's a very busy man with a lot on his plate. I'd like to also mention one more time our thanks for the generosity of our sponsors, Lockheed Martin and Huntington Ingalls Industries, without whom we couldn't bring you this Maritime Security Dialogue. So from CSIS and Naval Institute, we thank you, and we thank our audience and thank our speaker again today. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's give him a hand.